There's a lot of reasons why the Roman Republic fell. We've talked about quite a number of them already, and we're going to get into more, but one of the most commonly cited reasons by historians and people that are interested in this period is moral decline. The idea is that Roman ambition got out of control, in particular with the ruling class of society, whereas probably earlier in the Republic, more people in the ruling class were willing to channel that ambition in service to the Republic. Towards the end, it seemed like that ambition was being channeled into self-serving and career-advancing and wealth-accumulating moves. This moral decline is usually depicted as something sudden, like this is just something suddenly that happened with the rise of Julius Caesar or Octavian or whoever. And it's also sometimes depicted as something that was slowly developing over time and slowly getting worse as the Republic went on. The ancient historian Tacitus said, quote, "From time immemorial, man has had an instinctive love of power. With the growth of our empire, this instinct has become a dominant and uncontrollable force." End quote. There's no doubt that this ambition and this greed and this lust for power was a big factor in the Roman Republic falling, as we're going to discuss, but it's also useful to look at this as something that was actually built into the system. There was always a conflict between ambition on the one hand and equality on the other hand. This was something that was built into the system, and the tension between the two is in large part just a history of the Roman Republic. When the metronome swung one way and that ambition got too out of control, bad things tended to happen. And when the metronome swung the other way and populism and the desire for equality got too powerful, disaster usually struck as well. This duality of ambition versus equality is at the heart of Roman society and politics, and the more you look, the more you see it, whether it's patricians and plebeians, Romulus and Remus, consul versus the Senate, the role of the tribune of the plebs, and there's all sorts of ways that you could interpret this theme going all the way back to the beginning of Rome. Historian Barbara Levick has written about this phenomenon, and she says that it's often popular for historians, and particularly ancient historians, to analyze history through this sort of moral perspective. The ambition and the greed and the corruption getting out of control, this sort of moral decay, this moral decline, is the main factor that led to the decline of the Republic for many of the ancient historians. But Barbara Levick says that perhaps this might be a little bit too simplified as far as a robust explanation for why the Roman Republic fell. Here's what she says, quote, "The language of morals has always had greater appeal than that of austere historical inquiry. It allows historians a place in the world of action. But if those of ancient Rome had pursued their inquiries further, they would have found something perhaps unacceptable to them, that the tension between individual and group was built in, that there was nothing to be done about it, and that any series of shocks was likely to unbalance it, either in the direction of Spartan austerity, if the state was strong enough, or towards one-man rule. Ancient analyses of the fall of the Republic are inadequate because they neglect a built-in tension in Roman political and social life between ambition on the one hand, and on the other, the principle of equality. By examining that tension, we may help to explain both the fall of the Republic and the ancients' preoccupation with moral factors." End quote. We're about to get to the part of the story in the fall of the Roman Republic where that tension between ambition and equality, kind of like two tectonic plates under the surface, collides. And when that collision happens, it's going to stress the Republic in a way that it has never been stressed before. After Rome's victory in the Punic Wars and their subsequent expansion to become the political and economic center of the Mediterranean, there was frustration building in the system, particularly among the lower classes and the average Joes of Roman society. Even though Rome was expanding throughout the Mediterranean, the administrative system wasn't expanding alongside of it. Contractors and not officials ran the show in the provinces for the most part. So it was contractors who built the roads, who worked the mines, who collect the taxes, and as we sort of talked about in the last episode, corruption seemed to be running rampant. And for the average soldier or the average citizen farmer, their farm was getting smaller, wars were getting less lucrative as far as plunder. It seemed like that super wealthy class of political elites was controlling the wealth accumulation, while wars in Africa and Greece tended to yield better results for soldiers. Spain was a guerrilla warfare nightmare, and during this time, many Romans were actually rioting to avoid going there. There was a simmering tension under the surface in Roman society. You'll often hear it called the conflict between the populares on the one hand and the optimates on the other hand. You'll see it framed as elites versus populists. I framed it earlier as ambition versus equality. Whatever you want to call this conflict, it's growing, it's slowly simmering, and from the time period after the Third Punic War to about the 130s BC, the scales seem to be tipping towards populism. That Roman lower class, the underclass, was frustrated with the fact that they seemed to not be gaining in the riches of expansion, and they were also frustrated with just some of the political, what they would see as political nefariousness on the parts of the ruling class. Just as an example, the way you voted in Rome in these assemblies a lot of the times was you kind of put your vote in a jar, and oftentimes this was not an anonymous process. So this, of course, could lead to voter intimidation and bribery and people trying to influence elections, particularly if you have the resources to do that. So just as an example, one of these conflicts is over what's known as the secret ballot. So the ability to vote anonymously was something that took a while for the popular assemblies to implement, and it was something that they wanted for a long time. And it's just sort of an example of one of these issues, and we're going to see a ton of them here with land reform or wealth and food distribution, whatever the case may be. There seems to be a lot of conflict in the Roman system. And it appears that during this time, cynical politicians began realizing that they could use cynical tactics and populism to gain individual glory rather than service to the Republic like before. Now, all of a sudden, advancing your career or gaining wealth and prestige for yourself seemed to be a tactic that politicians could use. And if that meant using that frustrated underclass of Roman society to get what you wanted and kind of play to them in a populist fashion, then that's what they were going to do. A great example of this in Rome is the coin minting situation that was going on. So traditionally, there had been a specific image on coins or a specific style of image that went on coins. Now, the politicians in charge of minting began to think to themselves, wait a second, what if we put some subtly self-serving images on here? We can use that as free political advertising and free political branding. So every time some poor schmuck pulls out his coin, he could see something that is some sort of image that benefits me somehow politically. An example was one politician put on a coin an image of his family that goes back to ancient times of those old productive Roman family members giving food to the poor, as if to say, hey, I'm here to help you guys. This type of targeted advertising could apply to any group. And these cynical politicians began realizing who's the most important group we need to cater to. Well, it could depend on your political goals and your political base, but oftentimes soldiers were targeted. It's never a bad idea to have a bunch of well-trained armed and dangerous people on your side. Oftentimes it was the tribune of the plebs, the person who was kind of in charge of those citizen assemblies and sort of saw themselves as the representative of the underclass of Rome, who took advantage of this situation. Here's what historian Edward J. Watts says, quote, "The innovative moneyers and reformist tribunes of the early 130s BC tried to build support for themselves by seizing on the growing popular discontent with the directions of Roman political and economic life. They broke with precedent to use their offices in ways that defined them as champions of particular reforms and that developed individual political brands. But none of them had done anything to threaten the stability of Rome's republican government." End quote. At least not yet, because the tension was rising, and it was just a matter of time before someone decided to really exploit this situation, and ultimately that exploitation could become a danger to the Republic. So in the late 130s BC, enter a man named Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius had a tremendous bloodline that he probably thought set him up for a tremendous political career. His ancestors were consuls and high-ranking officials. He could trace his ancestry all the way back to Scipio Africanus, the Roman legend of the Second Punic War. He was also highly educated. He was trained in philosophy and public speaking and persuasion. He had military experience. Overall, Tiberius Gracchus was a formidable person. Early on in his career, he found himself fighting in Spain, assisting a consul. He was a quaestor, and the army he was fighting in got surrounded. The people that Rome were fighting in Spain were known as the Numantines. I believe this situation was known as the Numantine Affair. But for various reasons, the Numantines didn't want to negotiate with the consul who was in charge of the army. So Tiberius Gracchus sort of ends up being the person that negotiates a treaty with these people in Spain, and ultimately it saves Roman lives. So it allows the Roman army to pull out without getting destroyed in exchange for giving up a lot of the plunder and a lot of the riches and a lot of the gains that they had made earlier in the wars. So Tiberius thinks he's a hero for saving all these lives and negotiating with the enemy in order to do that, but he gets home and the senators and the Roman political elite trash him for it. They say this is weakness. Rome doesn't negotiate with the enemy. I mean, you can remember back to the Second Punic Wars and what happened to those Italian allies that switched sides over to Carthage. Ultimately, best case, they were enslaved. Worst case, their cities were burned to the ground and their people put to the sword. So it's sort of like the modern day, our country does not negotiate with terrorists. That gave us, the plot of seasons 1 through 6 of 24, which we're all thankful for. But that was kind of the Roman version of that type of thinking. But for many of the quote-unquote average Joes of society, they were thankful for having all those lives saved. And in a way, Tiberius now found himself as champion of the people, in a sense. However, because Tiberius Gracchus now seemed to have made himself an enemy of the Roman political elite and the senators, he was shut out of the consulship. He no longer had the elite path that he thought he did to get to wealth and glory and fame. So instead of going for the consul, Tiberius went for the position of tribune of the plebs. He gets the position, and almost immediately he begins creating a campaign and trying to broaden support on the issue of economic inequality. According to Edward J. Watts, quote, "This economic inequality provided Tiberius with a potent issue that simultaneously inflamed the anger of ordinary Romans who felt that the new imperial economy had left them behind, and emphasized how Tiberius would continue to fight for their interests against the entrenched Roman elite." End quote. So Tiberius proposes land reform as his big political measure. This is something that we've been talking about has been an issue for the lower classes for a while now, And even people in that entrenched Roman political elite, as it was so called there by Edward J. Watts, he says that even people in that political elite thought that this was an issue that needed to be addressed. Tiberius says, let's parcel out some of this land. Let's take some public land away from the Italian allies who were disloyal at one point in time. Let's take some land away from the super rich who have these huge plantations being worked by slaves, and let's sort of parcel it out to the people that need it. Tiberius wanted to take land above a certain threshold in order to redistribute it to landless or poor Roman citizens, and he would do this taking away of land in exchange for compensation. This has broad support among the landless citizens of Rome who were forced to move to the city all those years ago, looking for opportunities, and it also had support among poor Roman citizens and smaller landowners. But ultimately it would hurt the wealthy elites and the Italian allies as well. Again, the Italian allies are just the people living in Italy who aren't citizens of Rome but are sort of under the Roman political domination. Unfortunately for Tiberius and the people who supported this land reform bill, the Senate was not on board. Here's why. Edward J. Watts says, quote, "What alarmed Tiberius's opponents in the Senate was not the practical effect of the law, but the principle behind it. A further cause for alarm lay in the reaction of non-Roman upper-class Italians, many of whom rented this public land and would have been adversely affected by the redistribution. Tiberius had then effectively proposed to take property used by Rome's Italian allies without their consent or their input." End quote. There's a lot of debate among historians about whether Tiberius Gracchus was seriously concerned about this land reform issue and the lower classes of Rome, or if he just wanted to use this issue in order to launch his political career and gain a huge base of support. On the one side, you could say that Tiberius was just looking at this situation rationally. The Roman economy and the industrial complex had expanded to just ridiculous heights that no one in Rome had foreseen, and it was clearly leaving out the lower classes of Rome in the wealth accumulation and the political capital that many others, sort of the wealthier classes, were capitalizing on. Roman soldiers were having their lands taken away and swallowed up by these big plantation farmers who were able to import slaves and buy up smaller landowners while they were away fighting in wars. The urban population of Rome was swelling, and it was a place where people went in order to find opportunities that they didn't feel like they had in the countryside anymore. And Tiberius might have been looking at this and been thinking to himself, this is a powder keg waiting to explode unless we do something. And there were certainly many senators and members of the political elite who felt the same way. They just didn't like the way Tiberius was going about trying to accomplish this land reform goal. Here are some examples of some of the tactics that Tiberius was using that the members of the Senate didn't like because it was breaking with Roman political tradition and Roman customs. So Tiberius broke with customs. He took the land reform bill directly to the assembly because he knew the Senate wasn't going to ratify it. He ends up getting vetoed by the other tribune, so that makes Tiberius double down on the law even more. He makes the law harsher, more redistributive, and he does the equivalent of shutting down the government. So he locks the doors of the treasury. He prevents any spending on anything really from taking place. Tiberius then wants to take a public vote to impeach the other tribune. The Senate responds allegedly by somehow making the voting urns disappear so voting couldn't take place. So all of a sudden there's angry mobs roaming around Rome looking for this tribune, and somehow he barely escapes. And instead of orderly political dynamics going on in Rome like they had for hundreds of years, you have chaos. And Tiberius Gracchus is fanning the flames of that chaos with his populism and with his desire to use the office of the tribune in ways that hadn't been used before. whether it was vetoes or shutting down the government or taking his laws directly to the assembly. This alarmed the Roman Senate because all of a sudden you have someone doing things that were not part of the norms of conventional political life, and many saw this as dangerous. Edward J. Watts says, quote, "Resentful of the obstacles that had been thrown in the way of his proposals, Tiberius fanned the flames of popular resentment against the narrow group of elites who blocked the state from responding to the needs of ordinary Romans. He did not actively encourage violence from his followers, but by potentially touching everyone in the city, the threat of physical violence that now rippled through Rome spread more fear than even an actual riot could. The volatility of Tiberius's followers constituted a potent political weapon that could fire anywhere at any time and for unpredictable reasons." End quote. Ultimately, Tiberius did get his land reform passed, but what ends up happening is the Senate, in this sort of game of political brinksmanship, Tiberius makes one move and raises the stakes, then the Senate does the same thing and the stakes keep getting higher. The Senate simply refuses to fund anything. So apparently, in order to get this land reform done, you had to have commissions and people going out and surveying the land and things like this. So remember, the Senate is in charge of foreign affairs and finances. So they just say, we're not going to fund anything. It's more gridlock and dysfunction until something bizarre happens. A foreign king ends up dying, and he gives his entire treasury to, quote-unquote, the Roman people. Again, typically finances are the affairs of the Senate, but Tiberius Gracchus sways the people's assemblies to take control of it. And boom, all of a sudden, the land reform is funded. The law is enacted, and Tiberius and his followers are satisfied, as well as some people in the upper classes who felt like this was necessary, but in the end, all the drama wasn't worth the change and the damage to the typical norms, the institutions, and the stability of everything running as it normally should. With all of the controversy and all of the obstruction and all of the political brinksmanship that was going on between the two groups, this caused lasting damage to the Republic, even though it's difficult to quantify. In his book, Mortal Republic, Edward J. Watts basically argues that all of this land reform wasn't that big a deal anyway. You could redistribute the land in the way that Tiberius Gracchus wanted to do it, and ultimately it wouldn't make a huge dent in the number of landless citizens roaming around, and it wouldn't make a huge dent in the finances of the wealthiest Romans. So all of this struggling and all of this drama over the bill ultimately did more harm than good for either side in this political battle. Here's what he says, quote, "Even if the commission had redistributed all of the public land in southern Italy, however, it is estimated that perhaps 15,000 poor families could then have been resettled, out of an Italian population that numbered several million. The reform would do even less damage to the wealthiest Italians. Although those holding large tracts of land in areas the commission proposed to redistribute would ultimately take a financial hit, land holdings represented only a small part of the diversified investment portfolios of Italy's wealthiest families. Few, if any, of the very richest families in Rome or Italy would be ruined by this reform, but many Romans would eventually be harmed by the breaching of institutional norms that it took to get land reform put in place." End quote. Old norms were being violated and new norms were being put in place. Probably the most insidious norm was that the threat of violence, thanks to Tiberius Gracchus and the drama that surrounded him, was now on the table. Here's what Edward J. Watts says, quote, "For the 150 years that had passed since the end of the conflict of the orders, the Republic had avoided political violence because Romans had largely respected the unwritten customs that determined how the Senate, magistrates, and assemblies divided power. Politicians understood the damage that could be done if one used the full legal authority that the assembly could technically claim as a tool to overturn the customs that shaped these patterns of interaction between different parts of the Republic. For more than a century, they had voluntarily held back from doing this. Tiberius's decision to openly challenge both the Senate and a sitting magistrate by direct appeal to the assembly deeply upset these norms. It was suddenly unclear which rules now governed political disputes and which mechanisms, if any, continued to check the power of the Republic's various institutions. Tiberius never ordered or even condoned violence, but he did make regular use of the threat of it." End quote. As he says there, it's now unclear which norms, which rules, which mechanisms are going to be followed. And of course, a cynical person could say, if one of these norms can be broken, why bother with any of them? And that's where we're going. Again, Tiberius never ordered any violence, but he flirted with it by encouraging rumors and speculation, by stoking mobs, by turning a blind eye, and perhaps fearing for his life after this land reform bill gets passed, and probably justifiably so. He has to run again for the tribune of the plebs position in order to protect himself. If you remember, the position of the tribune is seen as a sacrosanct, holy kind of position where you're basically untouchable while you have it and while you're in office. But as soon as you're out of office, you can be prosecuted, and in theory, you could be having violence done against you. Just the fact that Tiberius was running for tribune again was something that was unprecedented. So it was not illegal. Again, there's no written code that says you can't do it, but it hadn't been done before too often. So if the senators and the wealthy class of Rome is going to get Tiberius Gracchus, the time to do it is before he gets elected again. During the election process, some senators gather a mob, and, well, let's let historian Mike Duncan describe what happens next, because he does a great job here in his book, The Storm Before the Storm. He's going to be talking about a guy named Nausicaa, who was the Pontifex Maximus, who was the head of the Roman religion, more or less, and was well entrenched with the senatorial elite. Anyway, Mike Duncan says, quote, "Nausicaa then donned the formal attire of the Pontifex Maximus and put himself at the head of a mob of like-minded senators and clients. Together they marched to the temple of Jupiter. As weapons were not permitted to be carried inside the Pomerium, the sacred city limits, Nausicaa and his followers armed themselves mostly with table legs and other bludgeons. Though the coming attack was not premeditated, it was clear they were willing to use force to beat back the mob trying to make Tiberius Gracchus king of Rome. Meanwhile, up on the rostra, Tiberius was warned about the approaching mob. Tiberius's men turned and readied for battle, but hesitated when they saw the mob included senators and was led by the Pontifex Maximus himself. Though the Gracchan started to give way, Nausicaa's men aggressively pushed and beat the crowd anyway. Once the shoving and hitting began, Tiberius's supporters naturally fought back, leading to a line of clashes throughout the assembly. The casualties in the resulting melee were entirely one-sided. Tiberius's people were unarmed and made easy targets for Nausicaa's gang. Trapped in the confined space in front of the Temple of Jupiter, many people were trampled underfoot or fell to their deaths off the steep cliffs of the Capitol line. When the dust cleared, 300 people lay dead. The principal target of the attack was, of course, Tiberius himself, and it didn't take long for the reactionary senators to locate their prey. Near the entrance of the Temple of Jupiter, Tiberius tripped over the body of a man who had already fallen, and before he could get up, he was set upon by a fellow tribune and a senator. Though he was a tribune, and allegedly sacrosanct, these two men proceeded to beat Tiberius Gracchus to death with the legs of a bench." End quote. Looking back at this moment, historians have marked it in 133 BC as the beginning of the end. Edward J. Watts said, quote, "Romans understood that the Republic changed irreversibly on that day in 133. End quote. Plutarch claimed that it was, quote, "the first outbreak of civil strife in Rome that resulted in the bloodshed and murder of citizens since the expulsion of the kings." End quote. Appian said that after this event, there was, quote, no longer a republic, but the rule of force and violence, end quote. To make matters worse, historian Mike Duncan goes on to say, quote, but at least in living memory, Roman politics had always been waged without resorting to violence. Now hundreds of citizens lay dead on the Capitoline Hill. Whatever one felt about Tiberius Gracchus and his land reform, it must have been a shocking sight. The principal cause of the crisis of 133 was a dangerous game of mutual brinksmanship. And Duncan goes on to explain a lot of what we talked about earlier as far as the events that led up to Tiberius Gracchus' death. And he goes on to say, the Senate made no apologies for the attack. Tiberius and his dead supporters were denied traditional funeral arrangements and dumped en masse into the Tiber. This was in itself a shocking affront to tradition. The Gracchi were still a powerful noble family. Denying their son a proper burial was fraught with religious and social implications. But the story was now that Tiberius had been trying to make himself king, the most taboo of political offices, and the Senate determined that they could not afford a funeral becoming a venue for renewing violent revolution, end quote. The senators may have thought that they achieved victory by getting rid of Tiberius Gracchus, but the reality of the situation was the underlying issues and the problems that were facing the Republic were still there. Now you had Italian allies looking for a better shake on land reform and looking for citizenship. They felt like they got a raw deal as a result of Tiberius Gracchus' actions. After a few years, none other than Tiberius's brother, Gaius Gracchus, takes the stage in the 120s BC, expanding wildly on what Tiberius did, using the memory of Tiberius in order to gain popularity. Gaius proposed citizenship to the Italian allies. He proposed food distribution, land distribution, military reforms, colonies for landless Roman citizens, new tax collecting processes, eliminating corruption. And he's using that position of tribune to do exactly what Tiberius did before. And the Senate is unsure what to do. Do you block these laws and risk violence? Or do you let Gaius Gracchus get what he wants and potentially run rampant on his way to gaining power and prestige? The Senate comes up with a pretty devious solution. They decide to simply nominate their own tribune to simply outbid him on everything he does. So when Gaius proposes one colony to settle landless Roman citizens, this tribune that represented the Senate would propose 12 colonies to settle landless Roman citizens. If Gaius proposed to distribute 100 pounds of grain, the senators would propose to distribute 1,000 pounds of grain. And of course, the Senate had no intention of ever actually fulfilling these duties, but if they promised to do it and then decided they just would never do it, it turns out that the assemblies would buy it and they would often vote these guys in, just based on those promises. So Gaius Gracchus is voted out of office, and all of a sudden it's like deja vu all over again. Mob violence breaks out with Gaius Gracchus at the center. The Senate urges a consul to raise an army in order to deal with these mobs, and the consul did just that, crushing Gaius Gracchus, killing him and thousands of other Romans. Historian Tom Holland says, quote, Tiberius was clubbed to death with a stool leg in a violent brawl. Gaius, in 121 BC, was also killed by agents of the aristocracy. His corpse was decapitated and lead poured into his skull. In the wake of his murder, 3,000 of his fellow followers were executed without trial. In the Republic, there was no distinguishing between political goals and personal ambitions. Influence came through power, power through influence. The fate of the Gracchi had conclusively proved that any attempt to impose root and branch reforms on the Republic would be interpreted as tyranny. Programs of radical change, no matter how idealistic their inspiration, would inevitably disintegrate into internecine rivalries. By demonstrating this to the point of destruction, the The Gracchi had ultimately stymied the very reforms for which they had died. The tribunes who followed them would be more careful in the causes they adopted. Social revolution would remain on permanent hold. End quote. The Gracchan revolution that these two brothers and at this point thousands of others had spilled their blood for was indeed on hold. But perhaps the biggest influence that the Gracchi left on Rome was the fact that violence was now sanctioned and sanitized. As a result of this political brinksmanship, the idea that the norms and customs of the old republic were eroding, Roman ambition in the form of these cynical politicians seemed to be getting out of control. There was no mechanism to regulate between that duality of ambition and equality. Ultimately, all of those things and many more factors led to this disaster. The problem with violence is it's insidious, even in small amounts. Violence tends to beget more violence, and that's the path that the Roman Republic is heading down. Historian Edward Watts would say, quote, "No one could now be sure that disputes would play out peacefully. Any violent incident, however small, could now seem like a threat to the Republic. Although Gaius took pains not to use threats in the same way that Tiberius had, it did not matter. Once violence and intimidation became political tools, any disturbance at all provided an excuse for overreaction. The Gracchi brothers were the first victims of this new world Tiberius created. They would not be the last."